this is me. My Defenders of the Norman Crown is my 4th published book. It is actually the most personal for me, because I grew up around the corner from Conisbrough Castle, which, as you can see from the book cover, is actually on the cover. And I think that's the photo I actually took of it as well. So I grew up around the corner from Conisbrough Castle. I spent most summers, we had at least one picnic in the castle grounds. We didn't always go into the castle because we were 3 kids and my mum and dad, mum wouldn't always pay. So we sometimes just stayed in the grounds, but it was wonderful because you could roll down the hills, have a picnic, play hide and seek in the grounds. I don't know how many of you have been. I know Vanessa's been because I met her there. So yeah, when I was older, after college, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, as you do. So after 15 years in education, apparently working out what you want to do with the rest of your life is not easy. So I went to the castle and volunteered. I said, you know, do you need any help? I'm happy to do tours and things and to talk to people. And they said, we can't pay you, but yeah, certainly come in, you can do the tours for the school groups. Which is great, because I used to go up and down that castle 3 times a day and all the way to the top and all the way down again. I have never, ever been fitter than the 6 months I worked at Conisbrough Castle. And it was fun. School kids love castles and things. They love learning about the history and the toilets and the blood and the gore. Unfortunately for them, there's not a lot of blood and gore in the story of Conisbrough Castle. There's a lot of toilets. And there is one that doesn't actually have a drain, which kids love the idea of. They love the idea that you can go, that this castle has it's got a prison cell, probably used to be below the guard room. And there's a toilet in there. It's just as you go into the Bailey. And there's a toilet in this prison cell, and it doesn't have a drain. So if you were in there long enough, then it would start to smell, it would start to overflow, and it would get very uncomfortable. So anyone thrown in there, it was for petty crimes and things, or for sleeping on guard duty or something. But they probably wanted to make sure that they weren't in there more than a day or so, otherwise it could get very uncomfortable and pretty sloshy underfoot. So anyway, that's my history of Conisbrough Castle. So when I did my first book, Heroines of the Medieval World, I went over to the castle and I said, do you mind, is there any way I could host the book launch here? Because it's my first book, there are people in the castle in Heroines of the Medieval World, and I've got such a history with the castle. And they said, oh yes, please. And it was their first ever book launch, was my first book. And it was fantastic. It was a lovely day in, what was it, October. It was October the 14th, the anniversary of the Battle of Hastings. And it was such fun that hopefully I'm going to do the official book launch for Defenders of the Norman Crown at Conisbrough Castle next month. I'm just waiting to hear back from them to make sure we can do this. So let's get on to the Defenders of the Norman Crown, and I'll tell you a little bit about the family, but believe me, in this I can only touch the surface. They are such a fascinating family, and although they were only around for 300 years, they were involved in everything. So I will start with the family origins. As you may have guessed, with the name de Warenne, they're from Normandy. They're from the Warenne region of Normandy. The other ways, when you look in the chronicles, you can't look for William de Warenne unless you're looking in one written by an Englishman. It's either Guillaume de Warenne or Guillaume de Garenne. For some time, the Warenne was called Guerin before it turned to Warenne and then Warenne. So, yeah, so they came from the Warenne region of Normandy. William was a younger son, so he wasn't going to inherit the family lands. He had to make his own way. Luckily, he seems to have been quite adept at war. In 1054, he was at the he was one of the generals at the Battle of Mortimer, against the French king. And he won the battle, and one of his co-generals, Ralph de Mortimer, was son-in-law to one of the French generals. And unfortunately, after the Battle of Mortimer, he invited this French general to stay with him. William the Conqueror heard about this, so kicked the French general out. Actually, I think he ransomed him. And Ralph de Mortimer was kicked out of his own lands, and the lands Mortimer and Belancombre, which had belonged to Mortimer, were given to William de Warenne. Now, given that he was a younger son, this was quite handy for him. He actually had lands and titles of his own, and a chance to make something of himself. And he did quite well with it. He became one of William the Conqueror's prize generals. They were distant cousins. He was descended from a niece of Duchess Gunnar, who was William's grandmother. So they were distantly related, but not too closely. And they were good friends, it seems. William the Conqueror actually remembered William de Warenne on his deathbed, mentioning his service at the Battle of Hastings, which is how come Warenne is one of the few men we actually know for certain was at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So he did come over with the Norman invasion, and it sort of made his career sort of thing. He was rewarded greatly for his service. He was given most of Lewis, although that was later rearranged and part of it was split to give to Montgomery, I think it was. But yeah, he was given vast lands in Lewis, and in 1068 it seems likely that he came north with William the Conqueror and took part in the harrying of the north, which seems to be when he was given Conisbrough Castle and the honour of Conisbrough in South Yorkshire. Conisbrough and Lewis had previously belonged to King Harold. So it was, William benefited greatly from Harold's death at Hastings. And sorry, I'm just, oh yeah, people are joining, that's lovely. So yeah, he benefited greatly from Harold's death at Hastings, because out of that he got Lewis and he got Conisbrough. Now the other Warenne lands are in Norfolk, based around Castleacre. These came to William de Warenne in about 1070, 1071, and they came from his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law Frederick had possibly been in England even before the conquest, because there's a record of Frederick and Gundrada, two very Flemish names, holding 4 manors in Kent, which may be how come William and Gundrada's daughter was called Edith. Maybe there was some link to England even before the conquest. But basically, Frederick's lands were, after the conquest, were in Norfolk. And Frederick fell foul of the English freedom fighter Hereward the Wake. Apparently he was plotting to kill Hereward, but Hereward got to him first, and he was murdered by Hereward. We know this from a chronicle called the Hyde Chronicle, which has now been called the Warren Chronicle, and it's believed it was funded or written for the Warrens at Lewes Priory. It's called the Hyde Chronicle because it was found at Hyde Abbey in Winchester, but they think it originated at Lewes. So the Hyde Chronicle, or Warren Chronicle, tells us the story of Hereward and William de Warenne. After Frederick's death, William started a private feud with Hereward and plotted to ambush Hereward the Wake. Unfortunately, I think also they first tried to bribe Hereward's men to betray him. That didn't work, so they plotted to ambush him. Hereward got wind of the ambush, and instead of him falling foul of William, William fell foul of Hereward, and somehow he got knocked off his horse when he was hit in the chest by an arrow. It didn't break his skin. He was wearing armour, so a chainmail, so it didn't break his skin, but he was strong enough to knock him off his horse and knock him out. And then there's a story of William trying to get his revenge on Hereward after that, and shouting and having a big argument with Hereward. But that seems to have, then Hereward of course ends up in the Isle of Ely and eventually disappears. No one knows whether he was killed, caught, or just decided to retire. But William, because of Frederick's murder, Gundrada, William's wife, inherited the lands in Norfolk, which centred around Castleacre. So they've got these three massive centres of power: Lewis, Norfolk, and South Yorkshire, Knaresborough. And by the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, William was the fourth richest man in England and the richest man who wasn't a member of the royal family. So it was only, I think it was William the Conqueror and his two brothers who were the only ones richer than William in England. And William, as a result, is still in the top 20 of the richest men in history. He's in number 18 on the MSN, but I saw him at number 6 or number 9 on one, but I couldn't find that again, so I had to put the MSN one in the book. But I think being 18th richest man in history isn't a bad record when you look that was 1,000 years ago. So around the time of the conquest, William married a young lady named Gundrada, who for 800 years, everybody believed she was the daughter of William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders. And when I was researching the book, I found so many arguments where it said she was definitely the daughter of William and Matilda, or she was the daughter of Matilda from a previous marriage, which didn't sound that feasible, seeing as Matilda was supposed to be a young maid when she married William the Conqueror, so she wouldn't have been married before. What it was, the whole thing came from the fact that William and Gundrada founded St Pancras Priory in Lewis. And when a monk copied the foundation charter, so it's not the actual foundation charter, it's a copy of the foundation charter, he changed some wording, or he misread the wording, and he actually put that Gundrada was the daughter of the Conqueror. So from that moment on, everybody thought that Gundrada was William the Conqueror's daughter. And it's only when a historian went back and looked at the original foundation charter that he discovered that it doesn't say that at all. It just says that the charter was witnessed by William the Conqueror, Gundrada, and William de Warenne. So it doesn't mention any relationship between the Conqueror and Gundrada. But one monk misread it or deliberately changed it, because there's a lot to be said for royal patronage, even in those days. So they may have deliberately changed it. I prefer to give them the benefit of the doubt and say it was just an accident, but you never know. Gundrada, she had 3 brothers: Arnulf, who stayed in Flanders and looked after the family's lands; Gerbod, who became Earl of Chester, but in 1070 he resigned his post and went back to Flanders, which is probably when Arnulf died. Arnulf had at least 2 sons, so it seems likely that Gerbod went home to look after Arnulf's sons. Unfortunately, a few years after returning home, the Flanders was up in arms with a conflict between Arnulf II, Count of Flanders, and his uncle, who decided that he should be Count instead of his nephew, because Arnulf was only a young man. Unfortunately, at the Battle of Cassel, Gerbod accidentally killed the young Count Arnulf, and felt so guilty, he went to Rome and imposed self-mutilation on himself. He promised, I don't know, I was asked what mutilation, I don't know, it doesn't say. Basically, he said he was going to mutilate himself, possibly cut off the arm that killed the young man or whatever. But he was stopped by the Pope and told to join the monastery instead, and he joined the monastery at Cluny. And that's where Gundrada and William in 1070 or 1071 decided to go on pilgrimage to Rome, couldn't get there because of the fighting in Rome, so they only got as far as Cluny, which was where Gerbaud was staying. And it seems likely that the reason they founded St Pancras in Lewes and Castleacre Priory in Norfolk was because Gerbaud was had become a nun at Cluny, and they decided to favour the Cluniacs as the people who would found their monasteries for them. Now, Gundrada died in 1085 in childbirth at Castleacre. The story of her tomb is a story in itself. Basically, she was buried at the foundation of St Pancras in Lewes, and her tomb, like everybody else's, was lost during the dissolution of the monasteries. But then in the 1800s, when the railways arrived, they were cutting a spur through the grounds of St Pancras Priory, and they discovered two lead boxes, chests, which were Gundrada and William. And they were moved to a local church, and eventually they were moved to St John the Baptist Church at Southover, now called Holy Trinity, and they built a little chapel as well for Gundrada, called Gundrada's Chapel, in the church, and put her tomb in there, with gorgeous, it's just gorgeous marble tomb with bronze on top, saying all about her ancestry and that she was of noble shoots. So, and now I'm onto the page where St Pancras Priory gets mentioned. I really should remember what I've done already written wise. Right, so she was buried at St Pancras. William died in 1088. He was fighting at the siege of Pevensey and was struck in the leg by an arrow. And the wound turned septic, gangrenous, and he died in June 1088, I think it was. He shortly, just a few weeks before he died, or a couple of months, depending which source you read, I think Vitalis says it was a little while earlier, he was made Earl of Surrey. Now, what you find in the book, and what I found everywhere, is they called them not just Earl of Surrey, but they're called Earl of Warenne and Surrey, even though there's no sign of when they were made Earl of Warenne. So it comes up as Earl of Warenne and Surrey, and it tends to get shortened an awful lot to just Earl Warenne. There's only one other Earl, I think it's the Earl of Derby, Earl Ferrers, who gets his title shortened like that. So it's quite unique, and nobody seems to be sure why. But it does make it easier to say rather than Earl of Warenne and Surrey. Just say Earl Warenne, and everybody knows who you're talking about. Problem is, you've got 5 Williams called Earl Warenne, 2 Johns and a Hamlin. I'm so grateful for Hamlin. 5 Williams is really confusing at times because you're just writing William de Warenne, and wondering which number to put in there somewhere. So you find yourself saying William de Warenne the 1st Earl, then William de Warenne the 2nd Earl, and William de Warenne the 3rd Earl. So you're always, it was one of those things when writing the book, you had to remember to write the number of the Earl every time, because otherwise William de Warenne just isn't clear enough. So anyway, yes, the 1st Earl died in 1088 and passed the massive earldom onto his son, believe it or not, William de Warenne. And the 2nd Earl, he was probably about 20. There's no sign that he was made a ward of court. A ward of the court or anything. When his father died, he does seem to have gone straight into his earldom, but given that William and Gundrada only married around the time of the conquest, I could only work out that, and given that William de Warenne, this 2nd Earl, was Earl for 50 years, it seems that he was only about 20 when he became Earl. He rebuilt Castleacre, the priory, the village, and the castle, which actually was more of a manor house than a castle. And you discover that all through reading about the Warrens, you discover that they were massive builders. They built St Pancras Priory, they built Castleacre, which is a gorgeous, it's a planned medieval village. They planned every single thing about that village. So the castle is at one end of the village, the priory at the other, and the village is snug in the middle. With it did have a wall around it, not for defence, but so that they could put gates in the walls so that they could collect any tolls and make sure they got the most money out of the area by making people pay to go through the village. Yes, William the Warren II Earl, like I say, he was Earl for 50 years and he had quite a colourful career. His career sort of splits into two, which is his before he sided with Henry I and after he sided with Henry I. Because when he became Earl, the king was William II, Rufus, and William was loyal to William II. We get on with all these Williams again. Then when William II died, Henry I claimed the throne of England, but Henry wasn't the oldest son. He was the youngest son of William the Conqueror. The oldest was Robert Curthose, who had been given Normandy when the Conqueror died, and William II had been given England. But Robert Curthose decided that he was entitled to England as well as Normandy. He'd spent the early 1090s fighting to try and get England, but then gave up, went on crusade, and when William II died in 1100, Robert Curthose was on his way back from crusade. So Henry I took the initiative and seized the English throne. William de Warenne was like most Anglo-Norman knights. He had lands in England and lands in Normandy. So to protect his lands in Normandy, he decided to side with Robert Curthose. If he'd won, he would have protected his lands in England and Normandy. Unfortunately, Curthose wasn't the greatest general in the world and tended to act impulsively and not think things through. He invaded England in 1101 with William de Warenne at his side, but he failed to take an advantage. The two armies met at Alton and neither of them wanted a battle. So they decided to agree to a peace, Robert Curthose and Henry I. Unfortunately for William de Warenne, he was loser out of this peace because Henry I confiscated all Warrenne's lands in England, completely isolated him from the English administration. So Warenne had no choice but to flee to Normandy and beg off Robert Curthose for aid. Curthose apparently felt so guilty about Warenne losing his lands that he decided to come back to England in 1103, totally uninvited, and plead with Henry I to restore William's lands. As a result of this, everything he'd won in the Treaty of Alton, Henry I made him give up. So he'd won something like £3,000 in annual income from Henry I so that he wouldn't claim England. And he had to relinquish that so that William de Warenne got his lands back. In total ingratitude from William de Warenne then, Warenne decides, actually, Robert Curthose isn't going to get England, so I'm going to side with Henry I now. Now I've got my lands back in England. Bye-bye, Robert, I'm on Henry's side. But from that moment on, William was Henry's man. The reason William and Henry had a bit of a difficult early relationship was William's search for a bride. In the 1090s, William had set his heart on Edith of Scotland, who later became Matilda of Scotland. She changed her name when she married Henry I. But before Henry, William had had his sights set on her and was refused. Not surprising, really. She was a princess. He was just an earl, even if he was the richest man in England after the crown. So Henry had already decided he was going to marry Matilda. And when he became king, he made sure he did, which meant that William was out in the cold, no bride, approaching or about 30 years old, and still no wife, which meant he didn't have an heir. And there Henry is marrying the woman he'd set his sights on. So William, rather peevishly, decided to give Henry and Matilda nicknames of Godric and Goda, referring to Matilda's Anglo-Saxon origins and Henry's preferences for Saxons in his administration as opposed to Normans. Henry did try to appease William, and he offered him one of his illegitimate daughters. Unfortunately, the church turned around and said, no, you're still too closely related, so he can't marry her. So William, two possible brides down, and he's looking around for another wife. He does eventually find one. Unfortunately for him, well, this is according to Henry of Huntingdon. We don't actually know for certain that there was an affair involved and a kidnap. Henry of Huntingdon suggests that William kidnapped Isabel de Vermandois from her husband Robert of Leicester, sorry. To the extent that Robert of Leicester was so upset by it that he died of grief. This is Henry of Huntingdon's story probably comes from the fact that within a few months of Robert dying, Isabel married William. So we don't actually know that they were having an affair before Robert's death. It's just Henry of Huntingdon can be a bit of a gossip. What we do know is that Isabel de Vermandois, she was the granddaughter of Henry I of France. So William did finally get his royal bride. She had 9 children from her first marriage, and she was to have another 5 children with William. She'd married Robert of Leicester when she was only about 12 years old, and Robert was in his 40s. So marrying William now, this was in 1218 they married. So William would have been approaching 50, and Isabel would still only have been early 30s. So they had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. And what is remarkable is that the Warrens and the Beaumont step-siblings got on very well. William de Warenne, the Earl, was at Henry I's deathbed, not only with his son William, but also with his stepsons Warenne and Robert. And in the early days of the anarchy, when King Stephen and Empress Matilda started their war, the Beaumont-Warren faction was the most powerful faction at Stephen's court. It's the one thing I can't reconcile with the Warrens. I'm sorry, I would have been on Matilda's side. They were on Stephen's side. I don't know why they preferred Stephen. I don't agree with it, to be honest. And it is very upsetting. But yes, they were on Stephen's side. And they were the most powerful faction on Stephen's side. Warenne, particularly the oldest Beaumont twin, was very influential, especially in the early years for Stephen. In the later years, he was a bit dodgy on sides, and he did go with the Empress for a little while, then changed back, and then decided to give it all up and go on crusade. But yes, during the anarchy, you find the second Earl died in 1138. The third Earl had tipped his toe in the waters of the war in 1137 and joined Stephen's expedition to Normandy. Unfortunately, he was one of those young lords who ran away when it came to deciding whether or not to fight, and Stephen had to give up the expedition because nobody would actually back him and fight a pitched battle. It's funny, you hear about battles and things, but in those days they tried to avoid battle as much as possible. If they could avoid a pitched battle, they would, and a lot of the lords would refuse to fight if they weren't convinced that they could win. So a lot of the young lords, the younger generation, fled from Normandy. They were still with Stephen though, and in 1141, when Stephen fought the Battle of Lincoln, the third Earl was on Stephen's side, as were his half brothers William, Warenne and Robert. Unfortunately, they were attacked first by Robert of Gloucester's forces, and their people didn't put up a good show of themselves, were completely overwhelmed, and William de Warenne and his brothers were cut off from the rest of the battle, so they decided not to go back into the battle, and unfortunately as a result Stephen actually got captured at the Battle of Lincoln. William did redeem himself in August 1141 at Winchester, when Empress Matilda tried to besiege Henry of Blois, the Bishop of Winchester. Excuse the way I say Blois. I can speak French, but I can't pronounce Blois. So, yeah, she was besieging Henry of Blois, and Queen Matilda, Stephen's wife, who, when Stephen got captured, she took up the reins and actually did a better job than Stephen ever could. She came up to Winchester and besieged Matilda. So we have Matilda besieging Henry and Queen Matilda besieging the Empress. So you've got a siege within a siege. Unfortunately, the men of Henry of Winchester had set fire to the city of Winchester. So there was no shelter and no food for the Empress's people. And Queen Matilda had cut off the Empress's supply routes. So it was getting to be a desperate situation. The Empress's people decided to pull out of Winchester and make a break west, with Robert of Gloucester leading the vanguard to give his sister time to escape. Unfortunately for Robert, they were caught at a ford, and William de Warenne's men captured him. But that facilitated Stephen's release, because they managed to swap Robert of Gloucester for King Stephen in a really elaborate swap. Basically, Queen Matilda had to give herself up for King Stephen to be released, to go to Rochester to release Robert, who went back to Bristol to release Queen Matilda. It was very, when I was researching it, it was very complicated to work out who released who and who was given up as hostage to who. But basically, unfortunately for everybody, the fact that Stephen was released in 1141 meant that the war that didn't seem to be going anywhere, or no decision was ever made on anything, just carried on. By 1147, a lot of the nobles were getting fed up of it. They were making agreements among themselves to not fight each other and to look after each other's lands. And in 1147, William de Warenne and Warenne de Beaumont decided to join the Second Crusade with their cousin King Louis VII of France. And there's a touching story of William, before he went on crusade, going to celebrating the foundation of the new church at St Pancras Priory, and having his issuing it with a new foundation charter, and having his hair cut by the Bishop of Winchester, he and his brother, William and his brother, and folded into the charter. So somewhere in the Sussex archives, there may be a hair from the third Earl, from when he founded the church at St Pancras Priory. Unfortunately for practically everyone, the Earl was killed on the crusade. He was killed fighting in the vanguard at the Battle of Mount Cadmus. And it's one of the least well-recorded battles in history. It just says, all we have is a letter from Louis VII saying that they'd fought this battle and that his cousin William de Warenne was killed in it. So we don't know very much about Mount Cadmus at all. Just the troops, the marching column was stretched too thin, and the Saracens landed on them and destroyed the rear guard, and the Earl was in that. Before leaving for crusade, the Earl had married his daughter, Isabel, to William of Blois, the youngest son of King Stephen. This would guarantee that Isabel's lands were protected if her father didn't come back, and that young William who was the youngest son. Eustace was the heir to the throne. William was the spare. He would have substantial lands in England and Normandy to support his brother Eustace as king. Now, the problem was, in 1153, Eustace died. He wasn't a very nice man by all accounts. Nobody seems to have said anything nice about him. He seems to have been a rather cruel young man, but he was the apple of the eye of Stephen and his mother Matilda. But when he died in 1153, instead of setting up his younger son William as heir, Stephen saw it as an opportunity to end the anarchy by adopting Henry of Anjou, Empress Matilda's son, and having him as his heir. And poor William of Blois doesn't seem to have put up much of a fight, although there is a story that he did try to ambush Henry in Kent, but he fell off his horse and broke his leg in the process, and Henry managed to get safely to Normandy and wait until he heard of Stephen's death. He probably didn't expect to only have to wait a year, but in 1154 Stephen died. Henry of Anjou became Henry II. William of Blois, excuse me, still had his lands from Isabel and inherited his father's lands, the county of Mortain in Normandy, the honour of Eye and the duchy, more or less what is now the Duchy of Lancaster. Henry apparently thought he was too powerful, so he managed to confiscate all of William's lands that he'd inherited from his father, just to make him a little less powerful when William got in an argument with the Bigorres in Norfolk. And William seems to have been kept very close to Henry as well. Whenever Henry went anywhere, he took William. And when in 1158-59, he took William on his expedition to Toulouse. Unfortunately, William succumbed to the camp illness on his way home, probably dysentery, and died, leaving young Isabel, a young and very wealthy widow. It seems possible that Henry actually kept William with him so that young Isabel did not have any children, because if Isabel and William of Blois had kids, they would have been an alternative dynasty to rival the Plantagenets and a threat to Henry II and his kids. So it's understandable that he tried to keep them apart as much as possible. Now, Isabel, wealthy widow, wasn't going to stay a widow for long. There was a story that William of Anjou, Henry's younger brother, wanted to marry her, but Thomas Becket refused this because William was first a cousin to Isabel's first husband. He wasn't related to Isabel, he was related to Isabel's husband. So Thomas Becket refused the marriage. And so Isabel married Hamelin, who was Henry II's illegitimate brother and no relation to Isabel or her first husband. Isabel and Hamelin seem to have been a brilliant power couple. Although we do have that problem about the fourth Earl numbering, about the Earls numbering, because this is where it gets confusing. In some sources you find Hamelin named as the fifth Earl, and in some sources he's named as the fourth Earl. So all the numbering after Hamelin, you've got two different numbers, fourth and fifth for Hamelin, fifth and sixth for William, sixth and seventh for John, and sixth, seventh and eighth for John. Basically because Hamelin wasn't the fifth Earl, he was the fourth Earl, but he was the fifth person to hold the title. The earldom in William of Blois' time and in Hamelin's time belonged to Isabel. They only had the earldom by right of Isabel because she was the one who had inherited it from her father. So she was the fourth countess, which means that both William of Blois and Hamelin were the fourth Earl. But it gets confusing. I think I explain it better in the book, but it just, from now on, you'll have to remember that sometimes you're looking at the sixth Earl and it's actually the fifth Earl sort of thing. Right, so where was I? Yes, Hamelin. He was the half-brother of Henry II. He served Henry and John and Richard and John. He was another one of the big builders of the Warrens, and he built the very impressive keep at Conisbrough Castle, and another one at Mortimer, and another one at Peel Castle in Thorne near Doncaster, which was a hunting lodge, and it was three-sided. So when you see pictures, it looks like it's actually half of Conisbrough Castle that he built at Thorne. Conisbrough Castle is one of the keep is one of the most modern keeps of its time. Every kind of military innovation that he could think of, he put in there. But he did have a complicated relationship with John. Mainly, he had this motto, which was pro lege per lege, which was for the law, by the law. So he stuck by the law no matter what. So when John rebelled against King Richard, Hamelin supported Richard, even though the first rebellion in 1191 was against William Longchamp, the justiciar, who was a bit of a bad guy in himself. But Hamelin stayed loyal to Richard. Possibly persuaded by the fact that John did have an illegitimate son by one of Hamelin's daughters. We don't know which daughter, probably, I've narrowed it down to two, which is Ella or Isabel, but we don't know any further than that. But the son, Richard of Chilham, himself seems to have been a bit of a waste of space and tried to sell off all his wife's lands. But he was the illegitimate son of John by an unknown daughter of Hamelin. So that may be why Hamelin wasn't totally in John's favour. But then when John did become King of England, Hamelin was at the coronation, and John did stay at Conisbrough Castle while Hamelin was there in 1201. He was travelling around Yorkshire and he stayed overnight at Conisbrough Castle. I'm not sure what they would have talked about. I think it would have been a bit of a frosty reception from Hamelin, especially seeing as he was getting on a bit as well. Hamelin died in 1202 and Isabel died in 1203. After Isabel came their eldest son, William de Warenne, the 5th Earl, who was on John's side for most of John's reign. He only turned against John. He was with John at Runnymede at the signing of Magna Carta. He only turned against John when Louis of France invaded, and it looked like John was going to lose. So in order to protect his property, he decided to swear fealty to Louis of France, Prince Louis, when he took Winchester. And he only returned to the fold after John's death. So it seems that in about March 1217, John had died in October 1216, and in about March 1217, he came back to the English royalist camp. But he didn't renounce his fealty to Prince Louis until June 1217. So it's possible he was a bit of a mole in the French camp until after the Battle of Lincoln in May 1217, just so that sort of a spy basically, which is a bit ignoble of him, but there you go. Yes, this 5th Earl, he had married in probably the 1200s or the 1210s, but his wife died in about 1214, I think it was, and they had no children. So in 1225, he married Matilda Marshall, the eldest daughter of William Marshall, the Earl of Pembroke and regent for Henry III, and who everybody knows as the greatest knight and everybody's hero. She had been married to Hugh Bego, the Earl of Norfolk, but he died in 1225, and just a few months later, she was married to William de Warenne. It was probably a family agreement. It certainly wasn't a love match. They seem to have spent most of their time apart. If he was in Norfolk, she was in Yorkshire. If he was in Yorkshire, she was in Norfolk, sort of thing. Except they did manage to have 2 children, but it certainly wasn't a love match. It was a marriage of convenience, probably arranged by the families to protect Matilda's inheritance and for William to be able to have an heir. And he did in John de Warenne, the 6th Earl, and his rather sprightly and decisive daughter, Isabel d'Aubigny, who became Countess of Arundel. Isabel is one of my favourite medieval women. She's the one who, if you've read Heroines of the Medieval World, she's in there, and Ladies of Magna Carta. She's the one who Henry III stole some of her land. Well, he appropriated the land of an underage heir, and it was rightfully hers. So instead of giving in and just letting the king do what he wanted, she went to the king and famously berated him and said to him, "Where are the liberties of Magna Carta? So often, where are the liberties of England? So often recorded, so often granted, and so often ransomed." And she called him a shameless transgressor of the liberties laid down in Magna Carta. I think I'd have liked Isabel d'Aubigne. Henry said that, in reply, Henry said that she could have her lands back so long as she said nothing opprobrious to him like she had before. Basically, so long as she didn't tell him off again, she could have her lands back. So yeah, I like Isabel d'Aubigne. I think she is one of the best Warrens out. Now, her brother, John, the 6th Earl, was born in 1132. He was only 8 when his father died, and he became a ward of the crown. He was sent to the household of the Bishop of Winchester, Peter de Roche, I think his name was, to be raised. And unfortunately, the gentleman didn't do a good job of looking after John's lands and made a permanent enemy of him, so that when the Simon de Montfort started complaining about, just realised I haven't spelled outmanoeuvred right, when Simon de Montfort started complaining about the foreigners taking lands in England, John de Warenne was on his side for a little while, but then when Prince Edward fell out with Simon de Montfort, John de Warenne went with Prince Edward. So he was at the 1164 Battle of Lewes, which must have been really weird to be fighting in a battle that's right next to your family's mausoleum at the Priory of Lewes, because King Henry III was actually staying in the Priory of Lewes before and after the battle. So it must have been really weird for John to be fighting this battle around his family's graves. I haven't thought of that before. But he was outmanoeuvred in the battle and ended up fleeing the field and making it all the way to France to Eleanor of Provence. He was with his brother-in-law, the Earl of Pembroke, who was a brother of, what's his name, William de Lusignan. He was the half-brother of Henry III. And John, and throughout the Warenne earldom, throughout the generations, you see this family, they were a family. They worked together with their in-laws, their siblings, their half-siblings. They really did value family and working together. He was back in England by the time Lord Edward escaped from Simon de Montfort's clutches. He'd been captured in the Battle of Lewes and was held prisoner. And he had this elaborate plan to escape from de Montfort's son, who was holding him, by testing all these horses in a field. And he ran each horse until it was worn out, basically, until there was only one horse left that had any energy to do anything, and he grabbed that horse and fled, and of course he worn out everybody else's horses, so nobody could chase him. So he fled his jailers and met up with John de Warenne and with the Earl of Pembroke and started the Evesham campaign, which ended with Simon de Montfort's death at the battle in 1165. Now, I can't excuse John de Warenne for some things. He was a very harsh man. He was harsh with his tenants. He put severe men in charge of his lands, and in Conisbrough his steward would steal property, wool, from their tenants. He imprisoned a woman. They imprisoned a woman for a year for no reason and things like that. So he wasn't really a gentleman. But he did have a sense of history. So when he was asked, the quo warranto proceedings were instituted by Edward I to make sure that people who had lands had the lands that they were entitled to and that they owned, rather than lands that should have belonged to somebody else. So when John de Warenne, the 6th Earl, was asked by what right he held his lands, he held up a rusty sword, here you go, rusty sword, and said that he held them, that my ancestors came with William the Bastard and conquered the lands with the sword, and I shall defend them with the sword. So yeah, he was quite, I think he was what you'd call a man's man. But he did have a sense of humour, because then when he was challenged for taking someone else's lands in Sussex, he claimed that he held free warren of all lands in Sussex, which is basically all the rabbit warrens, by virtue of his name, Warren. So he held the rabbit warrens because his name was Warren. To be honest, whenever we have on my research trips for the Warrens, I take my son with me. He's 15 now, and we were at Peel Castle in Thorn, and there were rabbits everywhere. And he was just going, "Oh look, there's a Warren, there's a Warren, there's a Warren," claiming they were all descendants of the Warrens. So John de Warenne is famous for his antics in Scotland. Now, he wouldn't have been young by this time. He was born in 1232, so in 1296, when he won the Battle of Dunbar, he was already well into his 60s. He was 64. Edward I made him Guardian of Scotland, and he didn't like that. He didn't like the climate. It was not very good for his health. He was in his 60s, and we all know Scotland has a little bit of rain, and it was just too much for him. So he governed Scotland from England and left a couple of men in charge, the Treasurer Hugh de Cressingham, mainly, who the Scots decided they absolutely hated. But he did go back to Scotland when William Wallace started threatening, and in 1298 he was at Stirling Bridge, ready to face the Scots the next day. He'd set out the battle order the night before. Everybody knew what they were doing, and the next morning everybody got up, got ready to fight, advanced, and then found out that John de Warenne was still asleep. And when he woke up, instead of just letting them go, he called back the advance to start again. He said, "Wait till I'm basically made them wait till he got dressed before he launched the attack." Unfortunately, that meant the Scots were ready for them, and unfortunately Stirling Bridge is not very wide. It was only wide enough for 2 horses at a time, which meant that the Scots could pick out the English quite easily. And it was a massive defeat for the English. Hugh de Cressingham, John de Warenne's deputy, was captured, killed, and basically the skin flayed from his body. I think there's a lot of people in Scotland who have got pieces of Hugh de Cressingham's skin on, like William Wallace made a belt out of it or something like that. It was, they did not like him. So John de Warenne apparently saw the battle was lost and basically turned tail, and I say a lot about the Warrens retreating, don't I? He rode to Berwick and he didn't stop until he got there. One source says that he rode headlong to Berwick, and by the time he got there his horse expired as he got through the gates of the town. Edward I heard about the disaster and decided to come home. He was fighting in Flanders at the time, I think it was. He came home and launched a new attack on Scotland, taking John de Warenne with him, and they won at the Battle of Falkirk, defeated Wallace, who then went into hiding for a few years until he was captured and executed by Edward. John, this was more or less his final farewell sort of thing, because in 1304 he died, aged, what would he have been, 72. His son William de Warenne had died in 1286, having been killed in a tournament when his son was literally, he died in December 1286, and his young son John had been born in June 1286. So he had a 6-month-old son, and he had a daughter as well, Alice, and she possibly was a posthumous daughter. They don't know whether she was born in 1285 or 1287, but it seems highly likely that she wasn't born until 1287, so never knew her father. Now, young John, his mother died when he was 8, so he became a ward of the crown, and in 1306 he was very honoured to be given Edward I's granddaughter, Joan of Bar, in marriage. John was 20, Joan was 10, and the marriage was an absolute disaster. Got a feeling 20-year-old John wasn't prepared to wait for 10-year-old Joan to grow up, looked elsewhere, fell in love with a woman named Maud Nerford, and had a number of children with her, tried to divorce Joan, but the courts said no. He came up, over the years, he came up with so many different reasons. He pleaded consanguinity, meaning that they were too closely related, but they had a dispensation for that. And it was pointed out to John that only women, which I didn't know until I looked into it for this, only women can claim consanguinity. Men cannot claim a divorce through being closely related to their wives. Only women can do it. So that was a bit of a revelation for me. I thought it was both ways, but it isn't. Only Joan could have claimed that. And Joan didn't seem to want to get rid of the marriage because she never seems to have actually, there's no point where she turned around and said, no, let me get divorced. It was all John pushing for the divorce. And as the further he went on for this divorce, the more outrageous the claims. He also claimed that he'd had relations with Joan's aunt at one point, which was a bit incredibly outrageous, since Joan's aunt was Mary of Woodstock and was a nun and had been since she was 7 years old. But Mary herself did have a bit of reputation as a gambler, but not as someone with loose morals. So John was the 7th Earl, disastrous marriage, and living in some of the most dangerous times in English history, because it was the reign of Edward II. Edward II had favourites, Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer the Younger, and the barons were constantly fighting each other over who was on whose side, sort of thing. When Gaveston was arrested, it was actually John who transported him to his imprisonment and was actually ambushed by the people, the Black Dog of Arden, the Earl of Worcester, I think it was, who took Gaveston out off his hands and executed him. John, at that time, he was with 2 of his relatives, again showing how close they were. Henry Percy, who was John's first cousin through his aunt Isabel, not Isabel, can't remember, Alice, and Edmund FitzAlan, Earl of Arundel, who was John's brother-in-law. So again, we see that family connection. And it was Edmund FitzAlan that John was with when he refused to fight to join the Bannockburn campaign in 1314. Apparently, the summons to the campaign from Edward II had not been written properly, and the barons could refuse. So John and Edmund of Arundel did. Now, John also was in a private feud with Thomas of Lancaster, which got a bit excessive. Thomas had persuaded the courts to not allow John to divorce. Thomas was a cousin of Edward II and the most powerful noble in the land after the king. He didn't get on with Edward's favourite, and he set himself up to oppose Edward. And he and John had this argument over John's divorce, because of course Thomas was then cousin of Joan, John's husband, John's wife. So Thomas was trying to defend Joan. As a result, John kidnapped Thomas's wife, Alice de Lacy, and took her to his castle at Pevensey, I think he took her to, or Reigate. Thomas didn't try and get his wife back, but he saw it as an opportunity to extend his lands, and he besieged Conisbrough Castle. It was incredibly, very brave of him, leading his army against Conisbrough Castle, which was defended by 66 men, which were 3 men at arms, all with the surname Greathead, and the Greatheads actually still live in Conisbrough. And I think one of the men there was a baker or something. So it was like, he was attacking the castle with 6 defenders, and not all of them were even men at arms. The siege lasted 2 hours. There was some damage to a church. We don't know whether it's the church in the village or the chapel in the castle itself. There used to be a chapel within the bailey that's not there anymore. So we don't know what actually got damaged, but there was some damage. And the Greathead brothers were bound over to keep the peace because they'd apparently drawn blood or bruised some of Thomas of Lancaster's people. In order to appease Lancaster, the king wanted to keep him on side, so he let him keep John's lands, which were Conisbrough Castle and Sandal Castle in Yorkshire, and his castle at Holt in Wales, and gave him some lands in Somerset in compensation, which wasn't very great compensation. But unfortunately, it didn't actually appease Thomas, and Edward ended up having to send forces against Thomas, who fought at the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322 and was captured and then beheaded outside Pontefract Castle, which was his own castle, which is a big name, but there you go. So then we get on to the fact that John was the last Earl simply because he didn't get on with his wife. He didn't have a son to inherit. He spent the last 20 years of his life trying to write a will where he could let his illegitimate children inherit his lands, and he kept trying to change this will when he thought he might be able to divorce and remarry, but it never came about. In 1327 he turned against Edward II because he saw what was going to happen, so he decided to side with Queen Isabella and the future Edward III. His brother-in-law Edmund of Arundel wasn't so quick to see which way the wind was blowing and ended up being executed in 1327 for staying with Edward II. Edward III was on very friendly terms with John's wife, Joan, who had served Philippa of Hainault when she first married Edward, which probably didn't help John when he was trying to get a divorce. So by the 1340s, he tried again to get a divorce and it didn't work. It was a final attempt. He knew his health was failing, and it was final attempt to get an heir on his now girlfriend Isabella Holland. And when he did die in 1347 at Conisbrough Castle, he left a will, leaving items to his companion Isabella Holland, which included all his cattle and things like that. And then he left various items to his illegitimate sons and daughters. There were about 8 of them, if I remember right. They were all given money or gold, silver, various items, but he left nothing to his wife, Joan of Bar. He was buried at the family mausoleum at St Pancras in Lewes. His Yorkshire lands went to the crown and were given to Edmund Langley, 1st Duke of York, whose son Richard of Conisbrough was born at Conisbrough Castle. His other lands and titles passed through his sister Alistair Warren to his nephew Richard FitzAlan, the son of the executed Edmund FitzAlan, his brother-in-law. Joan of Bar lived until 1361 and kept the title Countess of Warenne and Surrey until her death. Richard FitzAlan wouldn't use the title of Earl of Surrey until only started using it after Joan had died as a mark of respect. And I am sorry I have waffled on. I didn't realise that was going to take an hour. I am going to have to shorten that a little bit, but there is so much more to tell you, and all I can say is you've got to read the book to know, to see more. Let me just stop the share now and get back onto the screen. Please feel free to put your microphones on now if anyone has any questions. I'm going to have a quick drink of this wine because I am thirsty, and I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions? Let me have a look in the... Wow, everybody's been so many comments in the chat.
I've got a couple of questions, I think. Sharon?
I knew I could count on you.
Yeah, well, we spoke about a few things the other night that I was reading about. One thing I just wanted to say about the arrow that knocked William, was it the first William, off his horse? I can't imagine it wouldn't have pierced his skin because he was only wearing chainmail.
Yeah.
And I know that chainmail has been known to stop arrows, but if it knocked him off his horse, I can't understand how it didn't pierce his skin. I just wanted to say that. But it could be one of those things that somebody had written and wasn't entirely true. But I just wanted to say that because I don't know what anyone else thinks, but that just seemed a bit weird to me.
Yeah, because it seems to say that it hit him in the chest. I mean, if it had hit his helmet or something and just sort of knocked him, caught him by surprise, you could understand it hit him in his chest.
I know. And to knock someone off your horse with an arrow, it would have had to have been going quite fast.
Yeah.
And it just seems unusual that it would have gone through chainmail and padded jack and not pierced his skin. It wouldn't have had much more protection than that. But anyway, I could be wrong. Actually, I really enjoyed that, Sharon. It was really, really interesting and really beautifully presented. And things I liked that what you talked about was when you described the Castle Acre. You know, and it makes me, now I've written it down, I've got to go there because I just want to see it. You've got to
go to Castle Acre. It is gorgeous. The priory is absolutely beautiful. It's some of the most beautiful architecture at an abbey that I've ever seen. That facade is just incredible. And it's just amazing the way the village is tucked between the castle on one side and the priory on the other.
Yeah, I'm just going to have to go there. I don't know if you ever want to do it sometime when we can, but that would be great.
Let me know and I'll meet you there.
Yeah, and I like, you know, what you said about battles being avoided at all costs. I mean, that is so true of the medieval period. People weren't that war hungry sort of lot that, you know, we tend to sort of kind of think they are. You know, and I know that, but you know, my period of interest is mostly Anglo-Saxon, but you know, you could see it throughout the 11th century.
The anarchy lasted almost 19 years.
Yeah.
But there were only four pitched battles in all that time.
Yeah.
It was, you know, they tried to avoid it as much as they could.
Yeah, because obviously, you know, you couldn't really afford to have really civil war in your country. I know that the anarchy, as you say, lasted for 20 years, but generally, you know, the idea of a civil war, if you had like people on the outside looking, you know, like, for example, in the 11th century, they had, you know, countries looking, you know, Norway, but Harold Hardrada and that were looking, you just couldn't afford to have a civil war.
No, exactly.
So it's quite true. That's a good point. I love the images on the presentation. It really made it. It was beautiful. It was so beautifully presented. And I was going to ask, do you think that John de Warenne ever actually consummated the marriage with Joan?
Because I don't know. I'm pretty sure he must have done when she turned about 15 or 16. He must have done, but
he seems to have kind of tried to avoid it all. But it's just, I mean, for her to have not said, okay, I'll, you know, just let him divorce me and I'll get, you know, I'll go and find someone else. It just sort of kind of doesn't ring true that she must have hung on to something that they had between them.
And yet in 1217, I think it was, Edward II sent a man to Conisbrough Castle to bring her to London, and he installed her in the Tower of London because John was being so mean to her. and the residents of Conisbrough tried to stop this man taking her, because they didn't know that he was from the king, so they thought he was kidnapping Joan, and they tried to stop him, and he had to say, no, I'm from the king, before they'd actually let him take Joan to London. So
really?
Edward II was looking out for her.
Yeah, it does sound like she had something that she just didn't want to let go, and it's quite a sad story, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think she possibly was in love with him, because I just think, from a 10-year-old with a 20-year-old husband, you know, that teenage crush thing must have been quite powerful. I think she probably had a teenage crush on him and just wanted to, you know.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw me holding up a bit of paper when you were talking about King Stephen and that.
No.
But I realised afterwards, when I looked and saw it, I couldn't even see what I'd written either. I was actually saying, go Stephen.
No.
Yes. I don't know why, but ever since I read it's like Christ in His Saints slept by Sharon Penn, I'm on Stephen's side.
I get that, but wait until you read my next book, Women of the Anarchy. You will not like Stephen by the end of it. Stephen's wife, yes. Stephen, no. I do not like him.
Well, I can't, but he had some charisma and stuff, but anyway, that was lovely. So I'll shut up now and let someone else talk. Thank you.
Alex, you asked me, was the 1141 Battle of Lincoln the same as the Lincoln Fair event? No. 1141 is the first Battle of Lincoln. The Lincoln Fair was the 1217 battle, the second Battle of Lincoln, which was between William Marshall and the French rebel army after King John's death. So there's two battles. One was the 1141 one was fought northeast to the west of Lincoln Castle, which was big rolling fields down the hill, and the 1217 one was fought between the castle and the cathedral, which is a really tight space. And you can basically, you know, the battlefield there was basically in the street sort of thing, whereas with the 1141 it was more a pitched battle. But yeah, two different battles. There's been 3 battles of Lincoln, I think it is. There was one in the English Civil War as well, but I haven't looked into that yet. So, Tony, Battle of Lewes, 1264. Did I put 1265 again? I keep
1164
in the wrong year for the Battle of Lewes. I don't know why. It was definitely 1264,
1164 and 1160.
Oh, did I say 1164? Sorry.
Yeah. I may be wrong on this, but you said that a man could not plead consanguinity as reason for divorce, but didn't Louis VII of France use that reason to divorce Eleanor of Aquitaine?
I think that was the reason.
Gave him daughters.
Yeah, I think that was the reason, but I'm wondering if Eleanor was the one who was made to do the appeal if the husband couldn't. I mean, she wanted, the difference with her was she wanted to get rid of Louis as much as Louis wanted to get rid of her. So I've got a feeling that she made the appeal for consanguinity. I'll have to have a look. It may just be, because it did say in it that it may have been that things had changed by that point as well, because this was the 1300s rather than the 1100s. And it may be that they decided to actually make it so that only women could do it because men were using it too much, sort of thing. So I'll have to look into that. But it was one of the arguments against, he was told at the time that he couldn't claim it because only the woman, the wife, could claim consanguinity.
That's interesting. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, I just want to add to this that at least in the mid-12th century, several high-ranking German nobles divorced their wives because of consanguinity, and it was definitely the man who did it. And
I'm going to have to look into that. I thought it was why it was that he was told he couldn't.
Yeah, I think it must have changed.
Yeah,
because it was people like Henry the Lion and Frederick Barbarossa who wanted to divorced their first wives because the all-important heir wasn't coming. And they were all related. And so it was easy to get out. So I think that later on, it was decided that it was too simple. Yeah,
brilliant. Anyone else got any questions?
Suzanne's waving, but she's muted.
Suzanne, you're muted. You need to turn your microphone on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello. Yeah, I had a question about Isabel Holland. So here she is, she inherits everything, and she has these children. What happens to them? Where do they stand within society?
Well, the children, they weren't allowed to inherit part of the... It's funny, I read a book a little while ago called The Illegitimacy of Bastards by Helen Matthews. And it's a brilliant book because it deals with what rights illegitimate children had in medieval England. And they weren't allowed to inherit any of the earldom. So any lands that belonged to the earldom, they weren't allowed to inherit. But anything that John had purchased himself that weren't part of the patrimony, they could inherit, or he could give them money rather than property. So he sort of set them all up. They had, they were mainly based in Norfolk. I think they had some inheritance from their mother, from their mothers. Most of the children were from Maud Nerford as opposed to Isabella Holland. So I think he must have had a couple by Isabella to want to marry her. But yeah, it was that they could inherit property but not land, sort of thing. So if they could have his cattle or his sheep or his plates and cups and clothing and things like that, but they couldn't have what was part of the earldom and they couldn't inherit the titles.
Did they go by Holland or by Warren?
Sorry?
Did they go by Holland or by Warren?
Warren. All his children were named Warren. Yeah, and there was one, I think it was Richard de Warren, who was descended from, I think it was Edward, John's son Edward, who went on the Mayflower. So most of the people in America with descendants through the Warren are from Richard, who's on the Mayflower, who's on the, well, they were all on the illegitimate line. Any surviving Warrens.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Alex.
Yes, a few questions. Thank you. First of all, thanks for the great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Let's see. First question. That one chap towards the end who had the feud with Lancaster and had to give up all of his property to kind of compensate for it, including Wales and including that keep. It turns out later he either died or was buried at that same keep.
No, he died in Conisbrough, yeah. When Lancaster died in 1322, John wasn't given his lands back straight away. He recovered them after Edward III came to the throne in 1327. So he recovered them at the early 1330s. So yeah, he was able to die at Conisbrough Castle, but there were about 20 years where he didn't have Conisbrough, which must have hurt quite a bit, because Conisbrough was, you know, it was one of his great grandfather had built it. It was one of the, it was iconically Warren.
Great. Also, and you'll have to excuse me as because I'm a colonist, I don't know a lot about your English history. I'm just picking it up as I go along. How recently into modern history did any of the English nobility trace their lineage back to some of these characters that you were speaking about from the 11th and 12th centuries? And how did they leverage that connection?
With the nobility, they always knew. They tended to make sure that they knew where their family was from and how they're connected. there's famously, I think it was Henry II, is said to have kept the family trees of every European family in his head, so he could work out how closely they were related when he wanted to marry his children off. And unfortunately for Henry II, his grandfather was a bit of a wild man as far as children were concerned. And he had 20 illegitimate children, and he married them off into various families in Europe. So for Henry II, he had to be really careful because he was related to practically everybody through his grandfather.
So how far?
They all knew who they were related to. And when you look at the Warrens, because they were, a number of them married several times, like William II Earl, he married Isabel de Vermandois, who she was a granddaughter of Henry I of France, and she'd been married to Robert Beaumont. So she had 9 children by one and 5 by the other. And they were married to they ended up involved in practically every family in England had a Warenne or Beaumont in the family because there were so many children to marry. And Ada de Warenne, William and Isabel's daughter, ended up marrying Prince Henry of Scotland as part of the peace treaty with the Scots during the reign of King Stephen. So all the Scottish royal family, from Ada and Prince Henry, all the way down, their son Malcolm the Maiden, Malcolm IV, all the way down to the Queen now.
So there are people today or very close to our time who trace their lineage back to Warren or Marshall?
The Queen is descended from the Warrens.
I do.
You do?
I do.
Well done. Well done, Mrs. Wright, or Lady Wright, I should say.
Queen Wright.
Queen Wright.
Come on.
And
your titles.
Final question, not quite on your topic, but of the period. I was interested in reading Churchill's book. It was news to me how strong an influence and largely populated England was by the Danes and the French. And I'm just wondering, are there still little provincial enclaves in England that embrace that Danish past or that French past culturally?
No, not
really. I think we're, excuse me. I think it's all amalgamated by now, to be honest. Oh dear.
There are certainly people in Yorkshire who, well, they're not Danish, but they very proud of this period. So, like, bring back the Dane law.
Geographically, you can tell one village from another.
Yes.
A particular type of village, a long, thin village, is said to be a Saxon village, whereas a Danish village would be all around a central green. So you can tell by looking geographically the origins of that community going back a thousand years, and the names as well. Something with a ham at the end of it would mean that it was a Saxon village, whereas something with a coombe would be a hill, or something with a wood would be
and
very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, we have plenty of indications of the origins of each village, especially around Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, where it was Danelaw.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
I would just say Shetland has connections with Norway in the
Yes. Well, Shetland was Norwegian for a long time, wasn't it?
Orkneys as well.
What happened?
Orkneys, yes.
What happened to people who were thrown out of their castles? Where did they go?
Well, unless, like with John, they were given alternative lands. If they weren't, then they had to rely on family. And they had to. There is instances within the Warrens where the 5th Earl's sister left. Her husband's lands were mainly in Normandy. So when in 1204, when John lost Normandy to the French, they went to Normandy to look after their lands because they had most of their lands there. They decided to go to Normandy, and they left their lands in the hands of William, the Earl of Surrey, to look after until times got easier and they could reclaim their land, sort of thing. So they tended to, if it was that they were being kicked out because they were swearing fealty to another king, they sort of gave their lands to their other family members to look after. If they were declared outlaw, then they would usually be forced to leave the country. If the king was nice to them, then their lands could be looked after by their own family, or he could claim them himself, sort of thing. So it was basically pot luck. If you had somebody to back you and look after you, then it was safer for you. Anyone else?
Well, Reigate. Was Reigate kind of linked to Lewis?
It was,
and all
yeah.
in the same kind of, because he's got basically 2 castles there, one at Lewis and one at Reigate.
Yeah, it was, sometimes they married into the Warrens, the ones who owned Reigate. Gilbert was Pevensey. Can't remember the name of the family, but yeah, by the time of the last Earl, Reigate was one of his castles, but I can't remember when they actually got it. But yeah, it was part of the Warenne Earldom by the end of the Earls of Warenne. Anyone else?
According to Jeannie, William de Warenne, the 1st Earl of Surrey, is my 23rd great-grandfather.
All right, wow. I like the 1st Earl. I think he was quite, it seems to have been quite a decent bloke. Well, except for what he did to the Saxons, basically, in the harrying of the north, and apparently he wasn't so nice to them in Norfolk. But
you can't be nice to everybody all the time.
No, exactly. He was looking after his family, sort of thing.
Go back far enough, we're all related to each other anyway.
No, I'm just going to say one brief comment. Is about avoiding battle. You did that if you were sensible, but I just remember there was one battle where almost, I don't know how to pronounce that, Amaury de Montfort.
Amaury de Montfort, yes.
It was 1123, the Battle of Bourg-Terroude. And so Warenne de Bourbon against Henry I, and again I say Omari. I said, don't engage in battle, it's too dangerous, and Warenne said, no, I'm young, I'm brave, and yeah.
Well, that was 1141 at Lincoln as well. Everybody was advising Stephen to not fight. Apparently, he'd been to mass in the cathedral that morning and everything went wrong. The candle broke, the pyx holding the host fell, broke its chain, everything was going wrong. And it was like, look, there are bad omens here, Stephen. You need to not fight. And he could have not fought. He could have said, no, we're not going to, we'll retreat and live to fight another day. But apparently, they think that he decided to fight because of his dad's bad reputation, because his dad had gone on crusade, and instead of standing and fighting, he'd seen an approaching army and decided it was too big an army and he wasn't going to fight, and he fled and he got on a ship and he came home, to the extent that his wife was so embarrassed by it that she berated him so much that he went back to the crusade and got himself killed. So they think that Stephen fought in 1141 because he didn't want to be remembered like his dad was for running away, and he ended up getting captured.
Yeah, the Battle of Bourg-Terreau also ended badly for Valleran and his allies.
Yeah. It's basically don't fight unless you have to. Okay. Oh, thanks, Bev. Really enjoyed the presentation.
Go on.
It could be there was a book written by the Roman Vegetius on military tactics, which everyone who has anyone read. And one of the main rules was do not fight a pitched battle in the field if you can possibly avoid it. So it was standard practice to try not to fight a battle of the kind.
Well, the thing is, when you read about these battles, Tony, you read there are only a certain number of knights, men trained for battle. The rest are levies. You know, people just taken from the nearest towns. With the 1141 Battle of Lincoln, there were townspeople on Stephen's side, and on Robert of Gloucester's side there were a lot of Welsh levies, and they weren't armoured, they didn't have weapons, they had, you know, they just had their ploughs or whatever from the fields and that. They weren't armed, so you were putting you were requiring a lot from people who weren't trained to fight, so you would try and avoid it if you could. But Stephen didn't think that way.
Yeah, very, very true.
It was also, I've read, it was also to avoid spilling Christian blood.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, there's a big thing about that, spilling Christian blood and not being able, you shouldn't do it unless you had to, sort of thing. Anybody else? Sylvia?
I was just going to say there was a lot of time and money invested in bringing a young man up to knightly status, and he had to invest a lot of money because a horse and armour was worth as much as a really good sports car now. So there was a lot of money tied up in these armies.
Yeah, definitely, and that was the other thing. You didn't want to be taken captive.
Exactly.
You didn't want to be held for ransom by the other side because that could bankrupt you.
Yes.
You know, they could put a really heavy price on your freedom, so you didn't want that either.
Yeah, the other point I wanted to make was that when girls in the medieval times and up to about the 1650s or so were married young, they were married, but then they went home to their parents.
Yes, much of the time. Where did I just see that? I thought
lived at home, were finally finished off and educated. And it was only when they were about 18 or 19 that they then went back and lived with their husband.
It was either that or they went to live with their mother-in-law.
Exactly. They weren't pushed into bed and had to have sex at the age of 10. It wasn't considered safe or right.
No, although Joan did go with John, it actually says in the records that she was married in May 1306. She spent her wedding night with her aunties. She didn't consummate they made sure that the wedding wasn't consummated. She was too young. But a few days after the wedding, she did go with John to Yorkshire, and she was installed in Conisbrough Castle, and she spent the next few years between Conisbrough and Sandal Castle. But I don't think she wasn't old enough to be a wife yet, so she was being educated on the lands that she would run, sort of thing, rather than anything else.
And I think the church prohibited girls from having sex in marriage until they were about 12 or 13.
Yeah,
at
it was
the very
12
youngest.
The minimum age.
Yes, at the very youngest.
Still too young.
Yes, exactly.
Most of them waited until they were about 14, I believe. But
Well, the famous one is Margaret Beaufort, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one I always use when I use it as an example. It's like Margaret Beaufort. And on the other side, you have Joan Beaufort, the daughter of Catherine Swynford and John of Gaunt, who was Countess of Westmoreland, and famously kept married couples apart until the girls were 17 or 18. She didn't allow them to consummate the marriage until the girls were old enough.
Yeah, I remember that Edward the First was, or his wife and his mother asked him not to send their daughter to Scotland yet. Even I think she must have been like 16 or 17 at least. And much later, Henry VII was also begged by his mother.
Yeah.
Knew from experience.
Yeah, definitely.
Not to send his daughter to Scotland too early. Yeah. So.
Anyone else, or shall we call it a night, seeing as it's 10 to 9?
It was fascinating talk. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you very
much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Very good, Sharon. Well done. Congratulations.
Sorry about the technical issues at the beginning, but I probably should have had a chat with you earlier, Paula, and sorted that out. But never mind. It was fun. It's been really nice. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you all.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you,
Sharon.
It was great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you get the book, let me know, and I will send you a signed book plate to put in the front.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have another glass of wine.
Bye-bye.
It's gone.
Great. It was great.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Tony. Nice to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
And
Bye-bye.
you, Libby, I know your face.
Cheerio.
Cheerio. Thanks for joining me, Alex.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Bev. I can see your glasses. I can't see much.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. I got your book today. It's arrived today, so.
If you message me with your address, I'll send you the signed book plate.
I will do. I'll contact you on Twitter. Okay. Thank you
Okay.
very much. Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
I've got your book,
And I know you
Sharon.
got your book, Carrie, didn't you?
Yeah, I'm beginning it tonight.
Lovely. Happy reading.
I will enjoy it already.
I hope I haven't spoilt it.
It's fantastic.
Lovely to see you.
You're a star.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye. Right, I'm going to turn it off now if I can work
Go
out.
and drink your wine.
And Libby, I'll see you soon for lunch. We have to
Hopefully. Look forward to that. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Bev. Is Dan there as well, or is it just you tonight? You're on mute.
Right.
Yep, you're there now. Right, bye-bye. What did... No, don't tell me that.